One of the spokespersons for the CFA Institute actually put out some formal study recommendations that he would give to candidates hoping to pass the CFA exams. There are 9 different tips here. We're going to look at each one, and I'll give you the truths and the maybe half-truths that you can use to best take away from these tips to ultimately work towards passing your CFA exams. The first one is one of the best tips that he shares out of all of them, and that is to start studying early. He shared that many candidates have reported that the CFA exams are difficult primarily because of the volume of information that you need to be familiar with and are tested on. And the spokesperson, which is Wiese, cites that many candidates have reported having to skip entire sections of the curriculum because they run out of time getting close to their exam day in which they haven't yet mastered the information from prior sections and they just don't have a long enough runway to learn the new stuff. Obviously, having to skip sections could be detrimental to your exam performance if some questions from those sections actually get asked. It's very easy to underestimate the amount of time needed to prepare well for a CFA exam. It's why I talk a lot about getting in far more than 300 hours through any of the 3 tests. I think this is a great tip. The second tip is to know the format, and unlike the first tip, I basically feel like this one is pretty unimportant. And I'm not saying it's gonna hurt you to know the format of the exam, but first of all, the formats are just not that complex. So you're gonna pick up on what the question formats look like just by doing practice questions. And if you prepare right and you end up doing a few mock exams and especially an exam day experience mock exam before your real test, you're gonna pick up on what that format looks like just through practice and repetition. It's not something that I think you need to actively be thinking about preparing for. Next is that you should focus your study efforts on the CFA curriculum, which is sort of true and sort of not true. I can tell you not only from my own experience, but from the experience of hundreds, if not thousands of candidates, focusing solely on the CFA material can be extremely time consuming. I studied for over 600 hours for the level 2 exam, and that was using condensed video study lessons that really summarized the bulk of the content for me. But then I would go back to the curriculum for the blue box examples and the end of chapter or EOC practice questions. When we talk about practicing and getting repetition in answering these questions, yes, the CFA Institute's material is the best, bar none. There's nothing that's going to prepare you better than those practice questions. But just for getting exposure to the material, like your first rough pass, as I call it in my own study process that I recommend to people, you really don't want to spend time reading through all like 10,000 pages or whatever it might be for all the CFA books. If you can read study notes or watch a study video lesson, you might save a lot of time. And my final point there leads very well into his next tip, which is to manage your time effectively. This one is very, very true. If you spent all of your time on the first book, Ethics, and left yourself with 3 weeks to study the next 11 books or something for the level 1 exam, there's no way you're gonna pass. So yes, you need to be efficient with your time to study effectively. You need to cover all the material. In the last 6 weeks, you need to practice that material a whole lot. In the last 3 days, you need to memorize formulas. So there's this very important process that you should follow leading up to your test that if you're not managing your time well, you're just gonna miss steps along the way, and that's gonna give you a much lower probability of passing the exam. And that's why you shouldn't read all of the curriculum from all the CFA texts like he said just a little bit ago. I'll pause here really quickly just to share that I don't think I'm smarter than Wiese, who is one of the directors at the CFA Institute, but there may be an element to like the student knowing how to do the thing better that the coach has taught the student. You know, like if you have a professional baseball player and their batting coach is teaching them the best form to swing a bat with, that professional baseball player ultimately, hopefully, will become a better hitter than that batting coach is. Otherwise, the batting coach should be the pro baseball player. And through this YouTube channel, I've talked to and emailed with many different candidates, so I can give you a bit of a first-hand review on the effectiveness of some of these things. The 5th tip is to practice, practice, practice. And this is probably my favorite tip out of all 9 that he shares. And not just the idea of practicing a whole lot, and that idea is very good, but specifically, Chris says that do the practice problems, and when you get something wrong, make sure you take the time to understand why your answer was wrong, what the correct answer was, and what you should have done differently to get to that answer. And that advice is so beautiful because I've talked time and time again about how For the difficult concepts that you don't pick up on right away, and you do practice questions and get those questions wrong, the best way for your brain to go from not understanding something you've already read to now learning exactly how that thing is calculated is by getting it wrong once, looking at what your brain's process was to get to that wrong answer, and then understand the differences. And that understanding and revision and reading and rereading process is really how I think the human brain best learns difficult concepts. And much of the CFA exams are difficult concepts, in my opinion. So not only getting a ton of volume of practice in, but revising every time you get questions wrong. That's another valuable thing about practice is you'll see which questions you don't know. Probably nothing is going to be more valuable in your test preparation than that. The next tip is to plan out your exam day logistics, like what time you need to be at where you need to be and where you're going to be sitting and what calculator and pencils you need and all that. And much like the second tip that Chris Wiese shared, I don't really agree here. Now, I don't necessarily disagree because it's not like planning ahead is going to disadvantage you in any way in taking the exam. But as long as you're someone who's able to, keep track of 4 or 5 miscellaneous items when you walk out the door in the morning, and you know how to use your iPhone's map app to drive to the exam center, it's honestly not that big of a deal, especially now that they're all computer-based exams given at Prometric centers, which are more localized. Don't let the exam day logistics stress you out to the point where you become more nervous. So yeah, you need to know like where you need to be and what you need to bring. But other than those couple of things, the logistics are not a big deal. I really liked the 7th tip because it's very true. It's something that I am very aware of, but I'd never actually thought about explicitly until I read this article. And that tip is that there are no trick questions on any of the CFA exams. So don't think that they're ever trying to pull one over on you by asking something in a confusing way. And I give the CFA Institute a lot of credit there. They are always adamant about the fact that they try to ask questions in the most direct and straightforward language that they can. Now, that's not always possible with the ethics questions, which I know a lot of people complain about, but I still don't think they make those things intentionally tricky in their wording. Sometimes they are intentionally vague, maybe, but the point is they're not trying to trick you. They're just trying to ask you difficult questions to test if you know the answers to those difficult questions. I've always felt that they've asked questions in a very fair way. I like that Chris Wiese pointed out here that there aren't trick questions. Don't let that sort of also make you nervous on exam day. Just prepare well and you should be able to answer these questions directly. The one caveat there though, I'd never understood why the Institute had to do this, at least when I was taking the exams. There's a certain type of question where they flip like the A, B, and C. And if you've done the tests before, you'll know what I'm talking about. But let's say some scenario is A and some scenario is B and some scenario is C, and they ask you to fill in the bubble. Which one is true? Well, scenario A will be like bubble B, and scenario B will be bubble C, and scenario C will be bubble A. Like they don't let the letters correspond with what they lettered each scenario to the letters you need to bubble in on your exam sheet. So it just adds an unnecessary layer of complexity that, I guess a CFA charter holder's brain should be able to understand, which is totally fine. It's just like, really, is this how you're trying to, or what you're trying to test people on? I never totally understood why they have to do that. The 8th tip is to take care of yourself, and he calls out specifically sleep the night before any of your exams. This is totally true as well. I talk about this all the time in my own recommendations to candidates when I talk about the 24 hours before your CFA exam and actually not studying at all, not looking at any formulas or anything like that, because your brain is going to be a lot more efficient when it's well rested and hopefully as relaxed as it can be. And studying for another 12 hours on the last day when you've probably at least been studying for at least 100 to 200 hours, it's not really going to net you all that much more additional knowledge, but it will tire you out. And so even if you learned another 3% of information, but your brain is 6% more tired, then theoretically you shouldn't perform as well on the test. So it's just going to be a lot more valuable for you to rest and be relaxed and fresh and ready to go on exam day. The last tip is certainly the worst tip that they give out of all of these. I don't know really why they would publicize this. I mean, I get that for a certain subgroup of candidates, that seriously need to consider this thing, it makes sense for, but I just don't like them putting this language out into the universe. And that is that you should consider deferring, but carefully, only if you have to. I just really don't like the mentality around this. It's sort of like, I've done some distance running. It's sort of like if you're on a long run and you start to get really tired and you let these thoughts creep in that like, hey, I could just stop 2 miles early and walk the last 2 miles. The only way you're ever gonna allow that to happen, to sort of quit before you're done and do that walking, is if you let those thoughts creep in and you entertain them, and then you start to rationalize why it might be okay for you to do that. When you're in the middle of a difficult thing, it becomes very normal for the human brain to rationalize getting out of that difficult thing. I would just hate for the average candidate who's probably prepared relatively well for the test to see this tip and then go, oh, you know, some of these practice questions are hard. Maybe I should consider deferring. It's pretty easy, which it is pretty easy now to just take the test again in 4 months. I don't know. It's not the mentality that is going to help someone best prepare to pass an exam. It's just a stream of consciousness that can only lead to doubt and rationalization and ultimately foregoing, you know, trying to achieve this big goal that they've been working towards. Now, yeah, if you had some major illness and you're in the hospital for 2 months, defer your exam. I mean, certainly, but I think 95% of candidates should not even ever consider deferring. They should just know when they are going to plan to take their exam and then prepare well enough in advance to get themselves to the point where they need to be to pass it. So totally ignore number 9. Don't even let those thoughts creep into your mind. They're poison. Don't do it. Thanks for sticking around to the end of this video. As always, wait, I usually say that differently. Anyway, I appreciate you. Have a good one.